Easy.
Over to you, Kathy.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. My name's Kathy Tullis. I'm the chair of DA Spain, and I am lucky today to be able to introduce two great friends and wonderful people. B. Moorhead and Josh Houston work for Texas Impact, which has the unenviable job of lobbying the Texas legislature from stance, and they do literally are doing God's work at the legislature. They can tell you more about their backgrounds themselves, but I'm just going to leave you with this thought in this brief introduction. The Texas Constitution actually provides that the legislature only meets every 2 years for 140 days, unless there's a special session called. Most Texans of almost every political stripe wish that that could be changed to meeting for 2 days every 140 years. But so far, no luck on that constitutional revision. Anyway, Josh and B are going to give you the lowdown about what happens at the Capitol, and they are heroes for doing what they do. Over to you, Annie.
Okay. Do you have slides or anything? Do you need me to share the screen with you? Or
we did not make, or I didn't. Josh, did you make slides? I don't know. I mean, we'd love to keep it pretty informal. Great. And have people ask questions. And you know, I always start. Kathy knows I've taught classes at her church in Austin before, and we usually start by saying we can talk about anything you want for as long as you want, but we can't talk about everything you want. So we'll have to make choices somewhere along the line. So I'm going to just tell you a little tiny bit about Texas Impact, our organization, and possible ways that it might be useful to you even in Spain. And then Josh is going to talk to you about what's going on right now in Texas, which is crazy. So, and I'll start by putting in the chat all of our information in any way that you would want to get in touch with us or find out stuff on our social media or website. It's all there. So Texas Impact is a nonprofit public interest lobby organization, and we have, like most organizations like that, including the Sierra Club and League of Women Voters, anybody else like that that you can think of, we have a lobby presence, and then we also have a foundation that does 501c3 educational kinds of activities. We have about 20,000 members, and then our core membership is religious organizations, so like dioceses and synods and things like that. We are the oldest and largest interfaith advocacy network in Texas. We're the only thing that's like us in Texas, but there are organizations like Texas Impact in most states in the United States. They are, when we talk with colleagues in Europe, just because this is maybe interesting for your context, something that people are frequently interested in is sort of on the one hand, how the faith community is present in the policy advocacy space, sort of under the banner of being faith-based, and then by the same token, how unsupported public advocacy is from the government side, so that it's generally the faith community and civic organizations, again, like Sierra Club or League of Women Voters, that are driving the public participation in the policy process. So we see ourselves as having, therefore, kind of a unique role and responsibility. Our members generally are people of faith and conscience. They are, denominations in the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Muslim tradition, also Buddhists, Unitarians, Hindus. There's so very broad range of traditions represented. But when we go into the policy space, we're not going with kind of a theological agenda. We're going to work in what we feel, and I mean, I think is affirmed generally, is a very pragmatic, nonpartisan, sort of sensible, rational policy framework. Increasingly, that's been a very hard framework to maintain in Texas. And in particular, you will have heard, I know that, when people think about faith-based advocacy in Texas, they don't think about organizations like Texas Impact. They think about organizations that are highly ideological, that are not interested in consensus building, that are not necessarily pragmatic. It's making it sort of hard for organizations like ours to claim and hold the space that most people in most faith traditions are mostly moderate, like most people in most situations everywhere. And they don't mostly seek the kind of extreme ideological policies that are getting presented in Texas at this point on a daily basis. It's just sort of every morning a new awful surprise to open the newspaper and see what's next. In the information that I put in the chat, we are on social media a lot. We are on our website. You can typically find blogs and resource materials on a wide variety of policy issues. And we have a podcast that is weekly. We have an e-newsletter that's weekly, and we have a YouTube channel that, while it doesn't have like a consistent weekly YouTube program, we are frequent YouTube posters of how-to videos and little explainers about what's going on at the Capitol. So even if you are not in Texas, and even if you are not necessarily so connected to a particular faith tradition, or don't feel like faith is your frame that you're coming from, I really do hope that you'll consider, especially after you hear what Josh is about to say, I hope you'll consider sharing the information that we do put out there with people who might be interested. And to the extent that you are a Texas voter, or that you do have relationships here that make you politically engaged, it really is. I feel like we're all kind of a little bit taking on a Zelensky tone in our presentations lately, but it really is pretty bad, y'all. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and he's going to explain to you some details about exactly what is pretty bad right now. And I guess leave time, hopefully, for plenty of questions. So I'm going to mute and let Josh have the floor.
All right, thanks, boss. I'm Joshua Houston. I'm an attorney and a registered lobbyist. I'm the advocacy director of Texas Impact. I've been with Texas Impact for 11 years, and then in or around the Texas legislature for about 16 now. Like B said, I want to make sure we do leave lots of time for conversation at the end. So I'm going to touch on 3 things at a high level, and then happy to circle back to any of those things as we have conversation. First, I want to debrief the primary. I want to make sure we understand why what is happening is happening. It's because of those that bother to vote. 2, I want to talk about what the primary means for governing. So in other words, the legislature is doing what it's doing because of the primary. What is the legislature doing, and what are the dynamics of it that you don't always see, even in the media necessarily. And then 3, I want to talk about how governing is affecting real people, because after all, that's what we really care about. We're going to discuss politics the way that a whitewater rafting guide talks about the river conditions. Our concern is getting everyone downstream safely. But unlike whitewater rafting right now, it is not safe, but we've got to go downstream anyway. So let's start with the Texas primary. I want to make the bold assertion for those of you who are not from Texas and may not care about the Texas primary. The Texas primary is actually the most important election in the nation, and thus the world, that no one bothers to vote in. And we'll talk a little bit about why when you see the policy areas as we kind of inductively go through what is happening in Texas. The primary is where every statewide office has been elected since the 1990s, since I was in high school. In 95% of the Texas legislature, 95% of Texas legislators I am stuttering, forgive me, 95% of the Texas legislature is effectively elected in the primary. That's both parties. And that's a function of gerrymandering because of the way they draw the districts. The primary has super low turnout. Most of those House races, there's 150 members in the Texas House, they represent 190,000 people. We're a very big state. And those races routinely, every time, come down to fewer than 100 votes because so few people participate. So pre-2018, it was roughly 10% of the voting age population that bothered to vote in a primary. When you break that down by party, it's 8% Republican and 2% Democrat. I have a bit of sort of good news. The silver lining is that since 2018, primary participation is up. It is up to a whopping 13%. It is still 8% Republican and 5% of the voting age population participates in the Democratic primary. So all of the growth is on the Democratic side, kind of entirely. And that trend has held truth from 18 to 20 to 22. So it's not just a one-time effect. But let's talk about the differences between 2022, this current election cycle, a midterm year, and 2018, the last midterm year. Unlike 2018, in 2022, on the Republican side, there were no clear moderate choices for the voters, which in 2022, no one ran that way. It was everybody running to the right. And so what that means is that there was really no moderating signal sent by the primary voters like there was in 2018. In 2018, there was a very clear moderating signal sent after the so-called bathroom bill in 2017 session. There was a very clear signal sent in both the primary, Republican primary, and then again in the 2018 general election when then candidate Beto O'Rourke pulled within about 2 percentage points of Ted Cruz. That sent a very clear signal. That there is no signal on the primary side the way there was in 2018. However, the ultra-right didn't necessarily have a very good night either on the other extreme. They lost 15 of the 19 races where they were challenging somebody in the state house. And then they didn't win 4, they just forced a runoff in 4. So they're still yet to be decided if they actually prevailed. They have prevailed in pushing the policy conversation, however, even if they haven't prevailed in putting their candidates in office. So let's talk about that governance a little bit. How does all this primary, if you think government's broken, I'm here to tell you it's doing exactly what those that bother to vote are telling it to do. And so let's talk about what they're being told to do. You'll notice that in this presentation, I'll overemphasize and focus on the Texas House, which is just one half of the legislature. That's because that's where the action is. We know of no other state legislature that has historically at least been controlled. The state Senate is controlled by a hard right, ultra right faction of the party. The House has historically been controlled by the business wing of the Republican Party. And that dynamic played out all through the 2010s. So I used to be able to say Texas talks crazy, but legislates sane. And there were a number of procedural reasons why that's true. The main one being that our entire House of Representatives votes for the Speaker, as opposed to the majority party, like in the US Congress. That said, 2021 was a change in state. There is a new Speaker that was elected in 2021. The walls, so if from 2014 to 2020 represents the Texas Senate against the Texas House, the Texas Senate would catapult flaming tar balls and diseased corpses of bad legislation at the House to make it an issue in the primaries in Texas. The Texas House was the castle and it held by and large, but in 2021, those walls really fell. And there was no good electoral reason in the data, frankly. It was simply kind of a function of who they elected as the Speaker. It'd be a surprise if the House members really intended for that to be the outcome. It was probably a surprise to a good number of House members. because, and I'll give you an example. So in 2019, now Speaker Phelan was then chair of the Powerful State Affairs Committee. And he said to the press in 2019, it's 2019, we won't be bullying LGBT people anymore. And that was in 2019, but when he became speaker in 2021, that all changed. When he became speaker, Speaker Phelan really tried to avoid the trap of having the far right wing of his party declare him a rhino. And the problem is that you really can't do that and defend the Texas House against the Texas Senate. You have to, that's just kind of the nature of it. So all session long, our lieutenant governor, and I should make sure if you're not from Texas that you understand, our lieutenant governor is actually more powerful than our governor. The lieutenant governor's office is the most powerful office in the state of Texas, and it's not true in most states. So our lieutenant governor would say he was for something, our governor would cave, and then our speaker would try to hold the line, say he wasn't doing whatever it was, but then he ultimately would capitulate when the pressure mounted. And that was the dynamic all session long. And that has some very serious ripple effects for governance. Because remember, the whole House elected the speaker. That included members of the Democratic Party. And so many Democrats felt that they had been promised a number of things when they agreed to back the speaker, including, for instance, that there would be no gay bashing bills. And so, as an example, when those bills started moving in April of 2021, they felt betrayed. But here's where the fracturing of the Texas House starts. You have at that time not all of the Democrats feeling betrayed, and that's because a number of Democrats were made chairs of committees or had other powerful appointments, or they had concerns about redistricting. It was a redistricting cycle. So there are some very hard feelings between Democrats, and it only got worse when the quorum break happened in the summer over SB1, which we're going to talk about here in a second. On the Republican side, there's similar fractures. You have at least a dozen Republicans who are hard right, who will never be for the speaker, kind of unless he just always totally capitulates. You have another kind of at least 4 factions. So the second faction, there's another 25 that are pretty hard right too, and willing to use the rules to challenge the speaker. So the speaker really doesn't have control of his caucus. Then you have maybe 10 Republicans on the other side of the spectrum that would like a return to someone like the Speaker Strauss, which was our moderate business speaker during the 20 teens. And then you have another 60 in the middle who are just looking to avoid a primary at whatever cost. And so they are in many ways have become indistinguishable from the ultra right so that they don't get challenged in a primary. That said, they also don't like getting bullied by the Senate. And so, this is the weird dynamic the speaker is in, trying to appease all these different factions, and it doesn't really seem to be possible. Now I'll be frank and get to part 3, which is the policy, because policy affects real people. And we only care about this drama because it affects real people. Texas is at a real pivotal moment. We have 6 of the 20 largest cities in the US. We are a quarter of the nation's economy. And the next 2 to 5 election cycles will decide whether we continue down the path of being a cosmopolitan economic center in a multi-ethnic democracy, or do we change paths and become a socially engineered authoritarian petrol state. And the big unknown, the big variable is whether or not business engages politically on the side of democracy and the rule of law, or whether business accepts being bullied and or takes the first opportunity to mitigate their losses and just vacate the state. Whatever business decisions they've made kind of have come to term. So a couple of examples, we got some mixed results. It's not clear how it's going to come. In 2017, business was very active defeating the so-called bathroom bill and was very instrumental in that. They were severely punished behind closed doors for that advocacy. And you saw this happen in 2021 on voting rights. A couple of examples: American Airlines made statements that looked like they were going to engage on voting rights, and Lieutenant Governor held a press conference and just eviscerated them in public in a press conference. And of course, there was implicit threats and all of that was going to affect their business bottom line. You saw it with the Greater Houston Partnership, which is like a chamber of commerce in Houston. It's the big business entities. They had a complete fracture of their board in debating whether or not to engage voting rights. So far it's not going well as far as the business community being engaged, and which way business goes is really unclear at this time. Let's talk a little bit about policy. I want to start with Senate Bill 1 because I think it affects you the most, especially being overseas. So Senate Bill 1 was the voting rights bill. And of course, the right to vote is the right that preserves all other rights. It is the first priority that we have to defend. And there are, of course, a number of concerning provisions we could spend hours talking about, but I want to talk about the ones that impact you the most, because I'm guessing most of you vote by mail. And there is a very high error rate in the vote by mail ballots due to SB1. And so y'all might know better than me whether or not y'all had to put a new ID number on your vote by mail applications. I think y'all had to, but again, there are slightly different rules for military and overseas voters. So we wanted to hear from you about that. But here, for domestic voters at least, there's a very high error rate due to people forgetting or having the wrong ID number or putting a different ID number from a previous document. There's all sorts of tripwires with the implementation of SB1 due to this ID number requirement. So if you have a story about that, it would be extremely helpful if you emailed me. Put those emails in the chat box. My email is just Josh, Josh, at texasimpact.org. I said that now we can't represent you personally, but for the very first time since 1973, when this organization was created, we are a plaintiff in an impact litigation lawsuit. We are suing over Senate Bill 1 because as people of faith, we have a disproportionate number of people, well, for many reasons, but as people of faith, we have a disproportionate number of people in our pews who are seniors, 65 plus, and or voters with disabilities. Or in this case, college or overseas voters that have been affected by this particular provision. So as a member of Texas Impact, if you are a person of faith, you may already be a member of Texas Impact, and if so, it's nice to meet you. I'm your lobbyist. But if you are not a member of Texas Impact and wanted to join, whether you're a person of faith or not, just because you think we're neat, we can use your experience to further the litigation. Possibly as a witness or as a sworn declaration, or there's various legal ways that we can have you help the cause. I'll give you the initial data, and we are looking we're doing a big data run, but the initial data is quite scary. In Travis County, 10% of the mail-in ballots were rejected. This is before the cure period, so this may not be the final number, but initially 10% were rejected, which is way higher than the fraction of 1% that were previously rejected in previous cycles. Travis County is not unique. In Harris County, in a letter to the Department of Justice, they said that they had 35% rejected as of, this was February 15th. So this number may have come down, but it's still a huge number, whereas their previous rejection rates were 0.2%, a fraction of 1%. So these are exponentially higher rejection rates due to SB1, and it's deeply concerning for our members and their right to vote. Some other major concerns in Texas: the state is currently terrorizing families with children that identify as trans. The Attorney General put out an opinion, and the governor put out a letter. The Attorney General's opinion said that gender affirming medical care was child abuse. And the governor then directed state agencies to investigate any reports that they received. We are currently aware of dozens of roughly a dozen investigations that are ongoing. I'm a member of the LGBTQ section of the state bar, and there are a number of threads about referrals, looking for referrals for affected families. And that's the threat. And the threat is, I mean, the state has the power to seize children and put them in foster care. They have the power to then prosecute parents, although that would happen at a county level. And then they could prosecute anyone who's a mandatory reporter. Doctors, teachers, in our case, clergy, are mandatory reporters. They are then threatening prosecution of mandatory reporters that don't report. And so that's probably one of the most concerning things I've seen in my career in Texas. There's also a big fight between the lieutenant governor and the university systems over critical race theory and the teaching of it at an academic level. The lieutenant governor is threatening the tenure of professors and changing the law to revoke their tenure if they teach critical race theory. The professors, of course, are responding in force, saying this is academic freedom. How dare you? This fight is looming and coming. Already, though, it's having an effect on our institutions. A number of professors were in the job interview process with Texas universities, and they have pulled out of the hiring process because they just do not want to come to Texas. So it is not theoretical. This is already happening, where our universities cannot get the best and the brightest because of threats that the state government is making against their profession. We, of course, had the complete failure of the electric grid during a freeze that cost several hundred people their lives. We had during the regular session, it now requires, you have to have more training to drive a car than you to carry a gun. We have the unlicensed carry of firearms in the state now, where you no longer have to have a license to carry a gun in Texas. We have the functional outlawing of abortion in the state, and we have a multi-front growing conflict with our public education system. People who want to privatize the school system are seeing an opportunity with the COVID and many of the COVID restrictions that were created. They're also using the issue of what's in textbooks, including critical race theory, including anti-LGBT sentiment, to using textbooks as a way to go after those two things. Obviously, how trans kids play sports was a bill that passed, they're using various boogeymen to undermine and tear down faith in our public schools. And of course, they ultimately want to do this to privatize the school system through school vouchers, which would disproportionately go to religious schools. And these private schools are completely unaccountable to the democracy. When you privatize any system like the electric grid or the child welfare system, which have been increasingly privatized in Texas, you lose democratic accountability over it. And elected officials say, there's not much we can do about that. It's contracts, anyway, that is kind of I want to make sure we have time to talk. That's kind of a very brief rundown on where we're at in the state of Texas.
Thanks, Josh. I don't know if you saw my little exploding head emoji there. I'm just absolutely, sort of in a state of shock. Regarding your questions about Texas voters abroad who have had issues, we have Jennifer Van Astorf on this call right now, and she's the head of the Texans abroad state group team. And so she has a lot of information about Texas voters, and I hope that she'll ask some questions. I just had a question myself though before we touch on that point. You said that the lieutenant governor has more power than the governor. And
That's
so
right.
I'm wondering, we know that Beto won the primary, right, for governor, and I'm just wondering, if he were to win, how much power would he actually have? Who's running for lieutenant governor, and what is that scenario?
The three most powerful offices in the state are arguably the lieutenant governor, governor, and speaker of the House. We often call them the big three. And so you have one chamber, the leader of the other chamber, and then the governor, which has veto power. The governor still has incredible power. It's the power of appointment. They appoint judges. They appoint every state agency employee. Well, not every state agency employee, but every state agency head. There's still there's a whole appointments office in the governor's office that is quite powerful. And of course, there's executive orders and under the disaster declarations, a vast expansion of executive authority under the disaster declarations due to COVID. You have still a wide range of power with regard to the line item veto in Texas. So it is, I don't mean to say that the governor is not a powerful office. I just want to say that the lieutenant governor's office is more powerful than most states' lieutenant governors, because in Texas, the lieutenant governor is in control of appointing every single chair of a committee, appointing the committees, obviously, in their construction, and has a kind of single-handedly control of the calendar. So if the lieutenant governor wants to single-handedly squash a bill or move a bill, that's the lieutenant governor's power. There's no calendars committee like in the House. There's just one person. And so that one person can use the power of appointment to committees or the power to hear or not bring bills to the floor. It can be quite strong. It's a quite strong power.
I just wanted to add one quick thing to that, and that was a thing that happened when Rick Perry was governor, because he was governor for so long, is that there was kind of a change in the balance of power. The longer the governor is in place, the more granular is that person's control over state agencies. And where Texas stands right now is, if Governor Abbott maintains his post for another 4 years, he will have appointed so many people at so many levels of the executive branch of government that it would then be very hard for any legislative body to undo all of that, what from our perspective we would typically see as damage. I mean, the Governor Abbott, every single thing he has done hasn't been wrong, but I think we would say the balance has very much been not the direction we'd want to see.
Okay.
You got a question in the chat.
Yeah. Did you want to speak, Jennifer?
I think Andrea had a question, but I mean, I can go back to the signature pages. Hi, I'm Jennifer. We're having dinner here with my family, so I want to turn my video off. But we have a slightly different voting process than the absentee ballot by mail. You know, we use something called the federal postcard application, and it did change our voting. The SB1 did change what we have. So we have a signature sheet that we have to return with our ballots, and it looked significantly different this year. And it reflected these changes where you had to indicate either your social security number or your driver's license or an other, because we do have people who will use their passports as an ID. So what we're kind of waiting to hear is if anyone's ballot's been rejected because maybe they put their social security number instead of their driver's license. We tried to be really explicit with our members and make sure that they were aware of this, that they, used their FPCA when they were filling out their ballot to make sure that they used the same information on both. We'll see. There's supposed to be a curing process for the first time in Texas, and we've heard nothing about that. So I don't know if you have any information on what that's going to look like. I've tried to, find out if any of our members have been contacted to cure their ballots, but I don't know if you have any information on that. That would be great.
Yeah, it'll be a little more challenging because overseas ballots have 6 days to arrive, and the cure process is through 6 days. But if you sent your ballot early, it's going to be super challenging because there's supposed to be an online process that the Secretary of State was. So the Secretary of State's office was, we've heard at least, so busy auditing 4 counties for election fraud, and they found nothing of substance. But they were so busy auditing 4 counties, they did not get the forms out timely, including an extensive cure process that's supposed to come through the Secretary of State's ballot tracking website. So we're honestly not that clear either about how it would work. Obviously, y'all cannot just fly back to Texas to go to the county clerk's office and cure it in person. Y'all would have to do it online. And so that would probably be your only option. So I think y'all have kind of a unique voice. So if you found anybody's issues, if you found anybody that did have a rejection, that would be extremely material to the ongoing litigation that's occurring in a San Antonio federal court.
I mean, the other issue that we have is that we don't use the same ballot tracker. So, I mean, you know, I've seen the new ballot tracker, this ABBM ballot tracker, and it looks great, but we have something called the FPCA ballot tracker. And it's the only way that you have any course to know if you've even like sent in your ballot request. We have to do that every year. You can look to see if you're registered, but it doesn't matter. If you haven't sent in your FPCA, you're not going to get a ballot. And mine, I registered, you know, well in the, you know, first couple of weeks of January, because our ballots came out January 15th. It didn't show up that I had even requested my ballot until, I don't know, like a week before the election. I already had my ballot in my, I mean, I'd already like sent it back. So it's an incredibly unreliable source of information. It causes a lot of stress for our voters because they can't see that their ballot, I mean, you know, you don't really know what's going on, and it makes people feel like something's gone wrong, that they're not, it says you're not in the system. And what I keep checking is to see if it says, right now it says my ballot has been received. It doesn't say that my ballot has been accepted. So yeah, it's really hard to know anything from overseas, and the 6-day window for ballot curing seems almost impossible for us. I hadn't seen any information on it. I just knew that it was coming down the pipeline. So that's rather disturbing.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly how I don't know if the early voting ballot boards in each county start counting overseas ballots immediately as they're received, or if they wait until day 6. I
think they're allowed to start counting them on election day. So anything that's been received by election day, they're allowed to start counting then. So they definitely don't have to wait until day 6. But I don't think that they can do anything prior to election day, other than maybe like get them out of the envelope and prepare them to be counted, but they can't count them in advance. There are different rules for different states. But, oh, Texas.
Andy, you had a question? Or did you want me to read it?
Oh, I can ask it. My question was, since Republicans turn out in greater numbers than Democrats to vote, do you expect a greater impact to Republicans due to the new ID requirements under SB 1?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I'm just not sure. I mean, that was the crazy thing about the attack on vote by mail, is that historically, and that's why it's 65 plus in Texas, is that historically more Republicans have voted by mail than Democrats. I mean, mathematically, it makes sense. I mean, I was looking at the numbers earlier, and it was close to 2 million Republicans and just over 1 million Democrats. So it would make sense, but I don't know for sure. We'll have to look at that.
Thank you.
Because historically, I mean, people are just people, and they make the same mistakes, whether they're Republican or Democrat. When we do have some rejection rate data from 2016 through the primary of 2020, and we did not see any discernible difference between the parties as to who makes more mistakes than the other party. It was about the same. So statistically speaking, yes.
Well, maybe that's a bit of good news.
Josh, I have a question. We're seeing articles saying that there will be federal efforts in Congress to restrict the rights of overseas voters to receive ballots. Are you hearing anything rumbling like that on the federal level?
Ooh, a better source for federal information would be the national denominations. We tend to rely on each denomination that's a member of Texas Impact, Methodist, Episcopalian, Lutheran, take a pick. They all have federal lobbyists, and we really rely on them to do federal advocacy, although we do try to pay it some attention. I have not heard anything. And so that's a thing that we will certainly bring up on some of the national calls we sometimes get on.
Emmanuel, do you have a question?
Hi, not so much a question, but I wanted to give you some feedback on how the FPCA process went for me. So I requested it back on the 2nd of January, and then when beginning of February we hadn't heard anything, we ended up calling our county, Bear County, and it turned out they hadn't received it. Even though I have in my sent inbox, I can see that I sent the form properly signed, but they had never received it. So it's a good thing that my wife and I called, and we got ours late, middle of February, when they, finally received a second request, beginning of February. And we ended up having to call a second time. I want to point out here that in one of the forms, and I forget which one because it's so complicated, but in one of them you have to fill out your address, and it does not list country. And we were about to put in our last address in Texas, but I was like, no, wait a minute, this sounds a little weird. Let's call and ask. And sure enough, we find out, no, we were supposed to use a current address in Spain, even though there is no field saying country. So that's very misleading from my perspective. And the tracker you mentioned, I check it. All I can see so far still is that we've requested it. I still don't even see that it's been received, and we mailed it later than we had planned, but I think it was the 23rd of February since we received it so late. So it's a very tricky process.
Do Texas ballots have to be returned by postal mail?
Yes, we had to receive it by postal mail. So we sent it from Spain on the 23rd. In theory, it should have gotten there before March 1st, and then we have 5 or 6 extra days? I forget now exactly, but yes.
I mean, Annie, you can use like a FedEx or a UPS or whatever the equivalent is in
Right. Yeah,
in
because
those
there are some
countries.
states allow return by email or fax, but every state is different. Okay, so Jennifer, did you want to add anything else, or just that Bexar County is?
I mean, the problem, the big counties, for one, it's really hard to get the right person on the phone who knows about FPCA voters. I spent over an hour in 2020 trying to get someone in Dallas County on the phone to help a voter. In Bear County, I never got the one woman who dealt with FPCA voters on the phone, even though we had several people who had trouble in Bear County. It's really hard in the big counties to get the help that you need when you're an overseas voter. It's really, really, really hard. And they don't, they really only have one person generally who handles all of our voters. And I mean, Bear County has a lot of military. I mean, I could look it up. I have a county by county breakdown of how many voters there are, but I think it's around 10,000 voters who are registered in Bear County who are overseas voters when you include the military in that number. And, I know that they were also struggling because of the new rules. So I can imagine it was difficult, but it really is tricky because we don't have any kind of electronic means to make sure that our FPCA has been received. You're just stuck, and you have to get somebody on the phone, and they don't always answer their emails. It's a really, yeah. And this with the country, we had several questions come in about that too, because the previous form did have country on it. So it was relatively obvious that was supposed to be your overseas address. It doesn't just say put your overseas address. That they could do that, but they don't. And so this form, yeah, since they took country off, it's hard to know, what you're supposed to put on there. And I can imagine a lot of people probably did put their Texas voting address on there and got their ballots rejected. So all they have to say is put your overseas address. It's a statewide form. It's one standard form. So, I mean, that one sentence could save a lot of people that grief.
But just to clarify, so you would not currently have a system in place where you could collect information about rejected overseas ballots through Democrats abroad. Is that true? Because I will tell you, it would be a thing that would benefit American democracy this year if you did have a way to say, you know, in a couple of months, we can confirm how many rejected overseas ballots we got reported to us, even if you assume it's not all of them, because the best place to report it is the people who had the problem. Does that make sense? Okay.
I mean, we'll be communicating with our members again pretty quickly. But the main thing is we don't know whether or not our ballot was accepted or rejected. I mean, all we know is that it was received.
So Josh, are they not getting a letter? Because in the United States, I mean, if you were here in Texas, you would get a letter that would say your ballot is rejected and you have this opportunity to cure it.
As far as I know, I haven't heard, and we've put out feelers, but I haven't heard of anybody who's had that happen. And like I said, I'm just looking again to see if they've updated my status on the FPC ballot tracker, and it still just says ballot received. It doesn't say ballot accepted. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm not sure because it is a different.
It's a completely
got
different system. Yeah.
It's got some federal regulations attached to it that make it a different system than domestic. In theory, there's supposed to be an email option too, like where you can email your ballot, and I have no idea the status of that implementation. I mean, I know a thing that exists in statute doesn't necessarily exist in reality.
Do you know who would be the best person for us to contact? I mean, is there someone in particular in the Secretary of State's office who is easy to work with? I mean, we are happy to reach out to them, or, I mean, is there a...
I think it would maybe be a good idea if Josh and I were to put our heads together about that a little bit. And have you all, I guess, if you all are okay with emailing us, I mean, we put our email addresses in the chat, email us so that we have your email addresses and we could follow back up with you. Would that be okay?
That'd be great. I can put the Texans Abroad email address and that goes to our whole team. The other thing that we have, and I don't know if we have a Facebook group, and if you have somebody in your organization who just kind of like to hang out there, and if you ever have anything that you want to announce or need to let us know, I mean, it's a great discussion group, and we have a lot of we have about 350, 400 members. That's just a nice place to kind of, if you ever need to disseminate some information, that's a good place to go. I'll stick the link in for that too.
Thanks, Jennifer. I had a question about the ballot rejection, because you said that in Austin, something like 10% of the mail-in ballots had been rejected. I mean, I assume that that's much more than the margin of victory, right? In that area?
It would depend on what portion of people voted by mail. I can tell you in Houston, though, they're having, so I don't think it affects any of the races in Travis County, but there is going to be an issue in Harris County where there's a state rep race that was decided by about 120 votes, give or take one or two. I can't remember the exact number. And they found after election day, 10,000 mail-in ballots, 6,000 Democratic ones and 4,000 Republican ones. And there is a giant storm of feces, I'll say it without using a profanity, going on at the county commissioner's court as we speak. Right now, I'm seeing Twitter where there's, I think someone's going to lose their job pretty soon here. But there's a giant storm going on in Harris County over various issues with the implementation of the election. And so, yeah, 6,000 ballots in Harris County. There's probably about 20 state reps in Harris County. You can just do long division and say, yeah, that could affect the margin in that race. And I think it also affects who gets into the runoff for the attorney general on the Democratic side at a statewide level too. So it's not just a local issue. I think it's going to affect who's in that runoff, if I recall. I think it's the attorney general's race.
Well, the land commissioners, it's like between let's see, Jay Kleberg and, oh, who was next? Jenny Sue. So I think Jenny Sue was next, is like 1,000 votes. I mean, maybe not, or was that AG? Was it Joe and somebody was like 1,000 votes or 1,600? Joe, was Joe and Lee Merritt, right? Like 1,600
That's right.
votes.
Yeah. So there are definitely races that the rejection rate is affected.
Gosh. Wow. Can I ask a question about like county voting offices or the county clerk's offices? Are they politically leaning? I mean, those are not elected positions, right? Those are.
Well, it depends.
Okay.
So some counties, the county clerk that is elected is functionally the election administrator. And that's in a minority of counties. I think it's about 15% of the counties. Don't hold me to that number though. I think it was in that ballpark when I heard the stat. And then in the majority of counties, the county commissioners hire the election administrator. So they hire a professional to administer the election, but then they are hired and fired by the county commissioners, and the county commissioners are elected. So it just kind of varies a little bit by county. They are technically, some of them, yeah, they can be partisan actors. For the most part, they're not. For the most part, they're very professional. Our experience with them is that they really were the institutions that saved democracy, because they were really serious about getting it right. And they were the ones standing up and saying, no, this was done fairly, kind of across the board. This is where checks and balances of power matter, not just across branches of government, but levels of government too. Where the election administrators really were the heroes, and they are under assault. They are getting death threats from the far right. If you really want to have your hair set on fire, Google what happened to the election administrator in Hood County. I can find that article and drop it in the chat if you just want to be brought down further. They ran her out. The far right did, and they tried in Hood County. They tried to install one of their own as the election administrator, and by a 3-2 vote, the county commissioner said, no, we're hiring the professional of 14 years. And then after they hired her, she lasted about 2 years, where just the harassment and personal assaults just ran her out of the office. So it is a place that needs support from ordinary people. In fact, y'all are abroad, unfortunately, but if you have friends back home, the thing you should encourage them to do is to be election workers, because the number one challenge that election administrators told us that they need, they said, what do you wish people of faith would do for you? And they said, we need election workers, because in every single polling, there's 10,000 polling locations in Texas. Each polling location has 4 workers, a primary judge, an alternate judge, and 2 clerks. And the 2 judges are of the opposite party. And so what happens in a lot of more politically homogenous places, where if it's Travis County, they have a hard time finding Republican judges. And if it's a small rural county, they have a hard time finding Democratic judges to serve as the alternate judge. And so that's one of the things we like about our membership is it's 50-42-8, and we're pervasive, so we can find people to fill those roles. But that's the number one thing they said they need is election workers, because there were, in addition to all the mail-in ballot problems, we are hearing anecdotes about polling locations that did not open because they did not have enough workers to staff the polls. And that was this cycle in this March primary. And then one of the things we didn't talk about, but should talk about, is in Senate Bill 1, is the empowerment of poll watchers and the disempowerment of the election judges, the poll workers. So election poll watchers are appointed by a party or a candidate. They have no official function whatsoever with implementing the election, but they hang out and watch and look over the shoulder of the election judges, which, observation's fine. But the problem with SB 1 is that it authorized a whole lot of things that look a lot more like harassment of both the election workers and voters than observation. So it has made a lot of people think, man, I don't know if I want to be a poll worker. All these criminal penalties they can put on me, all these landmines, all these accusations. I know I've seen multiple reports of accusations that the poll workers were doing something wrong, when in fact they weren't. They're just baseless accusations. But it's just like a lot of people of good faith are just saying, no, it's too much. And that can't happen. That's a threat to democracy if that happens, because you have to have polling locations open. Because if polling locations don't open, people get disenfranchised. Whether either they don't have time to run across town to wherever they now have to go, or there's a long line while the county tries to get election workers out there to staff it. And long lines disenfranchise folks, especially folks that have inflexible job schedules or have children, childcare issues. They get disenfranchised by a line that's more than 30 minutes. So yeah, that's probably one of our biggest concerns about SB1 is the attack on poll workers. Nevertheless, that's the number one thing counties need. And if to the extent you have friends and family in Texas, encourage them to be poll workers. It's the most important thing. Plus, if you just want to know how elections work, I highly encourage you to be an election judge. That is not just good for democracy. It's good for democracy in multiple ways. It's not just doing your duty to implement an election. If for us, for people of faith, so we've been encouraging our members to do it for this reason. When they go to Sunday school and somebody drops the F-bomb in Sunday school, and the F-bomb I'm talking about is fraud. Someone starts talking about fraud. They have the credibility to be able to say that's not true. And are you going to convince that nut job? No. That person's setting their beliefs. That's not your audience. Your audience is all the other people in that Sunday school class who might think, well, there might be some basis to that. Oh, wait, you're an election judge? There's no basis to that? Okay. It's inoculant against disinformation, which in these days is important.
Do you have to live in the district in which you are working in the poll?
Yeah, it's a great question. So to be an election worker, you need to be a registered voter in that county.
In that county, okay.
In that county, yeah. So if I'm Travis County, I would have to work in Travis County. But that's a good thing. I see in the chat, have election poll workers been receiving threats? Yes.
That's terrible.
Yes, it is.
I wanted to know before I started encouraging my niece to be a poll worker, just to let her be aware of that if she did decide to.
Yeah, I don't know how widespread it is. It really depends on where you're at. I know one of the things that is concerning to us, and you can go watch it. It's a video. Don't take my word for it. Just go to Washington Post, and it was Harris County Republican Party poll watchers, or Google something close to that, it'll pop right up. There was a video, a training video. Someone got a video of a training where the Republican Party in Harris County was recruiting, I quote their words, an army of poll watchers. And they say explicitly with a laser pointer, we know where the fraud is. It's not here. And they're pointing at Western Harris County. It's down here. And they point to South Central Harris County, where the African-American population and Latino populations are. And they even say here, places like Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, which is an African-American Baptist church that is active in doing the work of democracy and having polling locations on site, and they do a lot of good democratic work. It's just that in their words, explicit. That's their intent, is to go intimidate folks at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church in places like that.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, we want to let you go so that you can get on with your day. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for letting us record. A lot of things to think about.
Will the recording be posted somewhere?
Yeah, we'll try to get somebody who can edit it down and post it on our YouTube channel. So yes. Would you like me to share that with you?
Yes, please. That'd be great.
Sure, no problem.
All right. Well, thanks for having us, y'all.